Welcome and thank you for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my conversation and dialogue with John Russon. I will give some context for who John is and some context for what our conversation is about, which was amazing, by the way, in a moment. But first, I have some exciting announcements and some housekeeping. So the next Circling Dialogos course is scheduled and you can sign up for it. You can now register. So it's open for registration. Links are below for that. The dates on that are February 19th and 20th. That's February 19th and 20th. That's a Saturday and a Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And that's taught by John, Vervaeke, Chris, and myself. It's our second iteration of this. So we're going to be continually to refine and co-discover this together. And we will be making videos, and there'll be a lot more information and discussions explicitly about what the course is about coming up probably in the next, in the next probably month and a half or so, pretty regularly. So keep your eyes open for that. But you can sign up right now. The link below. There's a discount. I think if you sign up 2 weeks before, there's like a $55 discount. And I'm super stoked about this work. And the first one really blew away our expectations. And I feel so alive and inspired by this. And so the links for that are below. Circling and the Circling Institute, which is the company that's hosting the Dialogos course. We also do trainings in learning how to facilitate the art of circling. We also have open drop-in events every Thursday night, and we have weekend intensives pretty much every month. So links for all of that below. And if you are interested working with me one-on-one, I am taking clients right now. My email's below. Just email me and we'll connect about that. All right, I think that's it. Okay, so John Russon, I'm just going to read off his bio and a little bit of his bio in Wikipedia. So John Russon has supervised the dissertations of many current professors of philosophy across North America on topics in Plato, Aristotle, Hegel, Karl Marx, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, John Dewey, and Merleau-Ponty. Russon has held academic appointments at Harvard University, University of Toronto, Acadia University, the Pennsylvania State University, Stony Brook University, and the University of Gallup. He is also the founder and main organizer of the Toronto Seminar, an annual private seminar for the study of philosophy held in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. He has written a number of books, and I'll list them off. He's written Sites of Exposure, Art, Politics, and the Nature of Experience. He's written Infinite Phenomenology, The Lessons of Hegel's Science of Experience. He's written Bearing Witness to Epiphany, Persons, Things, and the Nature of Erotic Life. He's also written Reading Hegel's Phenomenology, as well as The Human Experience, Philosophy, Neurosis, and the Elements of Everyday Life. And last but not least, the Self and Its Body in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. He's also edited 4 other books and written an enormous amount of articles. And I will I will post the links. And he has a YouTube channel as well. So all the links for that will be in the show notes. So as you can see, he has done his homework and is quite prophetic. And we talk about the source of his creativity and what it is that calls to him and why it calls to him, and how that in a certain sense, like a lot of things that we talk about in these conversations in almost like a fractal way, right? So there was a sense in which, the transformation that John is inviting or evoking in his work is also the very transformation that he has and continues to undergo in himself. I found him to be deeply personal, deeply kind, and genuinely is tuned into something very, very deep. And so I am just honored and excited to have him part of the conversation. And I'm right now making plans to invite him to conversations with some of the other people, into some dialogues, and we'll do maybe a series. But all that is to come in the future, and I'll let you know about that. But for now, enjoy the conversation. Welcome. Thank you for coming on, John.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, as we were talking, before, I've been really excited to meet you and talk with you about your work. On some level, I feel like I've had a relationship with you through going through your books, and especially for me, the awakening or the bearing witness to Epiphany, that I was first introduced by John Vervaeke in his work. And there's a sense, there's a way that you seem to weave together something philosophy and art and a lot of the traditions that we're familiar with, and weave them together that seems to like speak directly to what John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis, right? And there's I can imagine, I can sense you reckoning with that, right, in your work. But I'm just curious, like, how did you come to become a writer? How did you come to being a philosopher, if you consider yourself a philosopher?
Yeah. I mean, in one sense, that's a too big a question to answer. There's too many things probably go into that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'll start just with a remark about where you started, about the meaning crisis and so on. Yeah, I think the question that lies behind all the things I write, but also all the things I do, is how to make a life meaningful. So on one level, I think in our culture there would be all kinds of ways to identify a meaning crisis, and there's a question of like how is this culture going to make the world a meaningful place to live in and not destroy it and all the rest. Right. But even apart from that cultural crisis, I mean, that's an issue every person has to deal with in their own life. How am I going to make this a meaningful world for me? And our crisis, the crisis of our culture, is pretty serious. But in that sense, it's new. Like this crisis has never happened before, and maybe it's going to be the end of everything. Yeah. But there have been great times of crisis before. I especially think of I often think of Saint Augustine writing around the time, sort of the collapse of the Roman Empire, which is the sort of end of a civilization that had lasted for a millennium.
Yeah.
And in Europe, we think of that time as sort of the end of one world and then the beginning of hundreds of years of dark ages. Yeah. So I often think about Augustine as someone also living at a time when the world was kind of falling apart.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that his book, The Confessions, I mean, in his life, is also wrapped up with really deep issues of how to find your own life meaningful in that sort of context. So I think that issue of the crisis of meaning is quite an interesting one, because of there's a really interesting intersection between the challenge of making your own life meaningful and the context where you have to face the problems of a world
Right.
sort of falling apart. Anyway, so I think that's what's been on my mind, or that's what lies behind my work all the time. And so I'm going to say how I came here. I mean, I feel like I've always been doing the same thing since I was 7 or 8 years old. Like at some level, I was always trying to make my life meaningful, not in the sense that I was in a crisis. I think I actually had pretty happy childhood. But my father was a psychiatrist, and I think from a very early age, through talking with him, I was just attuned to questions of the human psyche and that issue of making life meaningful. So I think my whole life has been spent thinking about those questions with respect to myself. But I guess another dimension also is, and probably this also came from my dad, I was very aware of that issue of the importance for us of being sort of integrated with other people, and the importance of us being sort of respected and recognized by other people, and that idea that we can develop a healthy sense of ourselves and a healthy sense of our own life really only in the context where other people are in significant ways supporting that and giving us the kind of feedback we need to have a sort of healthy self-interpretation and so on. And so I think for me, that issue of the question of a meaningful life and that the issue of sort of intersubjective connection has always been where I was living. And I guess I've always been very attuned to that issue of sort of connecting with people and having that as sort of the core of where a meaningful life comes from. I mean, there are many things to say about what makes a life meaningful, but I think being able to connect with other people who are on a similar kind of journey, and I think that's absolutely essential. And so I really I don't know, I guess I've just been building that since I was a little kid, building worlds with other people, trying to collectively pursue meaningful things. I don't know. I mean, that wasn't an answer in terms of this happened and this happened and this happened, but that's a little bit about where I've been coming from.
Oh, totally. The thing I heard you, I think I heard you use the word attunement about 2 or 3 times in describing yourself, but also describing your environment growing up. And I got this sense of we kind of like tap on this just a little bit, like when I think about the father, right?
Yeah.
The father has has this quality of a gaze, right? Of like can be a distant, right? But just this kind of quality of an atmosphere. And so when you said, in some sense, with your father being a psychologist, that he was attuned to like deeper issues, it sounds like, and that you grew up, I the way you said it, I pictured a kind of an atmosphere of a listening that you just kind of formed in that attunement in some sense. Is that
yeah, I think so. Yeah. I have a 5-year-old son myself, and I think about those issues of what it's like for him to live with a father, and what kind of environment I'm creating for him. And so he goes around playing his games, playing with his toys or whatever he does, but he is always doing that in the house with me around, and whenever he's doing anything like talking with me and interacting with me, it's sort of a permanent touchstone.
Yeah.
And I think that was the same with my dad. Like it's not that my dad was sitting there giving me lectures on his views on psychological health, although we talked about those things too. But my whole young life was spent doing all the things I did around him, doing all the things he did.
Yeah.
And just in that context, I was living with a person who was attuned to these issues. I was living with someone for whom it really mattered how people respected the perspectives of others, how people struggled with questions of meaning, and so I think the human environment I was growing up in was one shaped by care for those issues.
Yeah.
And so that's I think the atmosphere you're talking when you talk about atmosphere, I think that's how it came at me. It's just I was always dealing with the world shaped by someone who cared about those things. I mentioned my dad. I could say things about my mom too, who also was a very nice person, and I think very influential on me. But I just picked my dad because that interaction with him did also lead into talking quite explicitly about psychological health, meaningful life, and so on. And I think I learned an awful lot of how I think directly from talking with him in the context of an environment that was very very charged with respect and curiosity and enthusiasm and that sort of stuff. I hope I'm creating a reasonable environment like that for my son too. We'll see.
Totally. I appreciate your I just felt the tenderness when you talked about you have a 5-year-old son.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Yep. His name's Theo.
Is Theo. Is this your first child?
Yeah.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thanks.
I just had I have a 3-month-year-old. It's my second son. The first one's 18. And so I'm just, and it's funny because I'm seeing something, talk about attunement, but as being older, which was kind of a ride to I was not expecting to have another child or for my wife to want one, right? And so that was kind of a reckoning, which I realized that there's no way to rationally deduce whether or not you could have a kid. There's just something.
No.
That's not that kind of decision. But I'm appreciating and hearing a lot of what you're saying as this sense in which I heard you say you're describing, in some sense, your father and your parents as being something in which you dwelled in, right? This kind of, on one level, there's probably these explicit conversations, right? In ways, things that he said but yet it kind of demonstrated out of this atmosphere of meaningfulness that was one of a sense of attunement to the inner subjective and who you were and that curiosity.
Exactly.
And it's I know one of the things that I'm noticing a lot with it in a striking way is just, I'm really seeing it this time. The human infant is so, it's like literally when you're looking at an infant, as far as I can tell, you are literally looking at probably the most vulnerable site of the known universe. Comparatively, I think I've heard evolutionary biologists say that compared to any other mammal, we'd have to be in the womb another 4 or 5 years or something, right? Literally. And so but what's fascinating to think about it, so literally as I look at Teague, who's 3 months old, he is only to the degree that he's held, right? There's no Teague of itself, but there's Teague being held. And if that holding goes away for just not that long of a period of time, like teak disintegrates into the environment. It'll be eaten, or it'll just kind of, in all these kind of strange, in these ways, and it'll be like that for a long time. We all start off like that, this deep vulnerability. However, we have to say, well, look at who's on top of the food chain, right? Like who's like staring into back through time and wondering about the origin of the universe. This relationship between vulnerability, right, holding, and this disclosure of the world, right, ability for as far as we know, as we understand, we are, in some sense, like, put it more poetically, but also kind of literally, it seems like we are that way in which all that is opened its eyes to itself, or thinned itself out enough such that it can see itself as itself in a very limited view, right? So this relationship between vulnerability and, in some sense, ability, right, to behold and to know, is a sense that I really kind of get, especially in your bearing witness to Epiphany.
I think that's what you said is great. I think it is really remarkable that the person, the human being, has such a a high calling. Like we ask questions about the ultimate nature of things, and we can take on the responsibility for being moral. We can open ourselves to being shaped by the highest demands. And at the same time, we start out as an organism so incredibly vulnerable, and as you say, like, you can't just drop a newborn child in the world and have it succeed, but it goes a long past newborn. Our reality is just so profoundly based on dependency. And so I think that's a really interesting thing that maybe more so than any other animal, are the very fabric of our life is dependency. And it's this intense way that every aspect of our being requires other people to make it possible. Right? That's having that as our fabric, it seems to me, is integrally connected to this fact also that we can grapple with the highest things and so on. But so I think that's a really important connection. And then that's I think thinking about that way that we're sort of made out of dependency on other people, I think is a helpful sort of corrective or sort of critical lens for thinking about the kind of goal of independence that people often have. People often sort of imagine that they could be self-sufficient, and there are aspects of that are good for sure, but there's something wrong if you imagine yourself as just an isolated being, and as if you think you do things on your own. Like, of course we need to develop skills and become responsible and self-responsible and so on, but there really isn't anything we do that didn't require other people to facilitate it, to make it possible. And I think one of our biggest problems in the world is living in denial, or more passively, I guess, just even living in ignorance of the relationships of dependence that we're actually relying upon. And then when we don't recognize them, we also mistreat them. So I think acknowledging, learning about our dependencies on other people, in material ways, you need other people to do work to have the nice life you live, and that's easy to ignore. But even more, this sort of psychological and other sorts of ways that we depend on other people, depend on the work of others, depend on the respect of others, and so on. I think ignoring that is really bad. Learning about it is one of the, maybe I shouldn't even say one of, maybe it's the most powerful and important way for making your life more meaningful, learning what it's about, and enriching your life, and also making yourself a more capable and responsible person. Anyway, so I think that thing you said is actually really gets at the heart of something. This connection between, in a sense, how weak we are and how strong we are, or how strong we can be. That great strength is premised on the incredible weakness of having to depend upon other people and the things that come through developing those relationships.
Right. I feel the aliveness of what we're kind of tuning into, and like the deep paradox that about this relationship. And it also strikes me as something like it seems inherently in this deep sense of dependency that, as you like astutely pointed out, really never ends for us, right?
Right.
However, because it's a kind of a contextual, especially as you get older and older and older, right? The holding isn't this explicit physical. It becomes more kind of psychological holding, emotional holding, and then like this kind of context, this sense of context or world, right? Yep. That works by virtue of it being transparent to us in so many ways, right?
Yeah.
And my sense is, I think what I gather about some of your work in Hegel, what I see you drawing out of Hegel, and I think it's clearly in Hegel. Seems like Hegel is one of the first ones that really grappled with this sense of, no, we're not just singular entities, right? But there's ways that we're so deep, like the slave and the master, that whole dialogue, in some sense, is trying to get, isn't it in some sense, is trying to elucidate this way in which we are deeply dependent and vulnerable to each other, that affords such a thing as an individuality, right?
Yeah.
And that he's trying to bring back into light that very dependency, so that we can kind of relate to it consciously, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And just speaking about Hegel, or in a way, I can go back to your earlier question about sort of how I got here. I think I mentioned my dad, and I think one of the things that my dad and I ended up talking about the most was that sense of our personalities being dependent upon a kind of intersubjective dialogue, and the need for intersubjective endorsement and support to be able to become a healthy individual. And I think it was because I sort of grew out of my family life into sort of independent adult life with that sort of as the issue on my mind, that I was particularly attracted to Hegel, because in Hegel, this he has this really quite profound analysis of exactly what you were saying, the sort of dialogue of mutual recognition by which people are formed. And he especially, like you mentioned the master and the slave and so on, he especially focuses on the problems of ways of living that are sort of in denial of that dynamic, and the problems that develop from that, in order to then explore, as you say, the deep and profound ways that our lives are shaped by structures of intersubjective recognition and so on. Anyway, I think it was because that was such a big part of his philosophy that it was so attractive to me. It really connected with with where I was already coming from. And so I spent quite a few years quite wrapped up in the study of Hegel. I mean, that's what I focused on in my PhD. And subsequently, I've written, I think, three books on Hegel, which is, just the product of some years of really relying on his work and his insights to help me develop my own thought about that. So I think that is, I think that is why the thing you said is why Hegel was initially so attractive to me, and why sort of the first leg of my sort of adult intellectual life was spent doing that.
Yeah.
But I also have been very influenced by other thinkers. The phenomenological tradition in general. I can't remember if you said Heidegger or if I was just thinking about this because of your use of you're picking up on the word attunement. But Heidegger and existential phenomenology was very important to me too, and also the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and I think especially Plato, have also from the beginnings of my academic life been hugely important to me. Plato was the first contact I really had with the sort of official world of the history of philosophy. And as soon as I read a page of it, I thought, oh yeah, that's the thing. It
spoke to you.
It really did, and I thought it's as if there was a it's like opening the door to a reality that I'd kind of been waiting for, and I think Plato is unparalleled for profundity and the permanent ability to re-enlighten us and so on. So I read Plato all the time, and now, so I think I started really sort of in the sort of professional sense of what I was doing my research on and so on. I worked on Hegel for a long time, but my work was always also quite informed by 20th century phenomenology. And then after working on Hegel for a while, I started writing more on that. But now most of my time is spent thinking about ancient philosophy. And I think that has actually been where my heart really has been from the very start. And it's hard for me to think about things other than Plato these days. I just find Plato so deep and rewarding.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's me kind of rambling a little bit in response to your remark about Hegel and recognition. I think I got connected to Hegel because he really does more prominently than pretty much anybody else make that issue of our dependence on recognition by others kind of foundation for his thought, and that's what he really wants to explore and make us recognize. I think that's essential.
Totally. I felt moved by your movedness of Plato, right? And like the way, actually, and something intuitively felt right about how you talked about, actually, the first thing that spoke to me, right, was the first plate. Like he grabbed you, right, in some sense, and that like even though like in your beginning philosophy work was really focused on Hegel, it opened with Plato, and it's returning explicitly now, where you're realizing like, oh, this is how I heard it, is like, oh, actually, this is what I've been looking at the whole time, in some sense, right?
I think so.
Because I don't know if you think this is fair, but my sense is, and I'd love to talk with you about the eidetic forms, right, and the notion of the eidos, right, in Plato, which I think is really, really mischaracterized, right, in unfortunately, about what the forms are. This whole kind of sense of like that there's a Platonic heaven, and right, there's a split between the two. And one of the things I really appreciate about your work is about like you're really, my sense is I do really see and experience your work as deeply Platonic, right? And there's a way that you're contacting what gives sense, or the forms, right, in a way that's really here, like it's really here, like it's more here than here, right, or something like that. And so there's one of the things I appreciate in your work is in some sense you're restoring, I think my sense was, what really Plato was originally talking about, right? But funny enough, and I was just wondering about what you think about this, I can also feel the sense in which you're almost like going through this ride with Hegel and Heidegger and all the continental philosophers afforded you to be able to hear Plato speak even more originally or something like that,
Yeah.
or more in that sense where because I'm experiencing the same thing with a lot of people in this formation of what we're calling dialogos, right? Which is essentially a modern response of salvaging, if you will, the Neoplatonic tradition, right?
Mhm.
And in the form of the Platonic dialogue, right? And all of the intersubjective things, all that sensibility as a connection with the logos, right? And in the sense of this way that the not philosophy just as propositions,
Mhm.
right? But relating those propositions in such a way that the logos that gathers them lights up, and then actually we kind of are formed by it and informed
Yeah.
by it, right? And my sense is what's odd about that is what seems to make that possible, at least for me, is Heidegger, who's massively critical of Plato, right? In fact, he's kind of like, in some sense, he makes Plato the bad guy, right? However, it's through grappling with Heidegger all these years that I feel that I'm able to see Plato in what he was really talking about was through Heidegger. And I get the same sense with you.
Yeah.
Would you
I
say
think
that?
that's right. Yeah, I think what you say is right. Yeah. I mean, Heidegger, but also not just Heidegger, about Heidegger, but also not just about Heidegger. I would say it's often the case that the great philosophical thinkers of our tradition aren't always the greatest readers of the tradition behind them, you know.
Yeah.
And so so I mean, Hegel is a good example of that. Like I have learned an incredible amount from Plato and from Hegel, and I've learned an incredible amount also from him talking about other philosophers, because that's in a way how his ideas come out sometimes. And yet I don't think his interpretations of other philosophers as a rule are particularly good. I think the things he says about Fichte and Kant, for example, are quite silly. But I still learn an awful lot from him talking about them, and I'm sure his development of his own thought came through working with those people in whatever way he was taking them up and so on. Like there's something surely productive and important in his relationship to those thinkers. I just don't think that's not Kant as I read it, or that's not Fichte as I read it. And so with Heidegger too, sometimes he says things about Plato and Aristotle that are amazingly insightful, Aristotle especially, but he also often says things that are sort of critical and so on, in a way that just seem to me to be really out of touch with those texts, and in a way that he either doesn't see or in some way doesn't acknowledge that the very thing he's talking about is what's alive in those pages. So I think it's true that he can be a little blind to that, even as he is sort of revealing it at the same time, but he can be blind to the fact that it's there. I think he also has Heidegger has allowed a lot of people, in exactly the way you were saying, he has allowed a lot of people to see in those texts things they weren't seeing before. In my own case, I don't think my approach to Plato I don't think it was in fact developed through that reading of Heidegger, but I suspect it in another way it happened because I was growing up in the decades I was growing up in, and I was having teachers who studied this and that, and even my dad's approach to psychiatry, I think, was informed by existential psychoanalysis, and which means was informed by people who themselves either were students of Heidegger or studied Heidegger or whatever. And so I think even though it wasn't it didn't exactly chronologically happen that I studied Heidegger and those ideas led to my interpretation of Plato. I think it is true that what I see in Plato is largely a consequence of the kind of perspective that developed out of figures like Heidegger and Sartre, I suppose, too, in the 20th century. So I think I'm a person who's very much informed by 20th century existential thinking that permeated the intellectual culture of the West. And so that also means when I eventually did read Heidegger, I think I already had a pretty strong affinity with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's so interesting. So interesting. If you allow me, I'd love to just read something in what you wrote, and I think
Sure. Yes, I'd be honored.
yes. um,
I'm very grateful, by the way, for the things you say about that book, Bearing Witness to Epiphany. It's a I did try to do some pretty serious things in that book, and I it's very nice to hear someone picking up on them.
Totally. Oh yeah, totally. And in fact, I'd love to get you involved in a lot of these kind of conversations that are happening, right? That feel like on one level they're very ancient, but it just feels like it's right on the pulse of like what's going on, right? In a strong way. So I'd love to get you in conversation with a lot more of these people that are talking about this, right? And experience your work this way. And one of the things through this process is really getting to know Plato and the Platonic forms. So there's this, I think it's number 3 here. And this is basically, this is my understanding is you wrote out, okay, here are the presuppositions or the ground rules of the way that we're gonna approach reality in this book. And there's one on number 3 here. I'm just going to go and read it out, and then we can kind of maybe zero in on it. That sense is an epiphany and a realization of form. Means both that we are always drawn beyond ourselves to bear witness to the miraculous birth of unanticipated, compelling realities, and also that any such realities can only be forms of engagement with our own bodily reality. In other words, the forms must answer to our possibilities for meaning at the same time as we must answer to the meanings thus informing us. So right there, it's like I can feel these two things of, on one level, there's the forms, right? And then there's this deep necessity of the body, right? Of our embodiment, right? Weaving together right there. I can kind of feel that sensibility. So first of all, what's it like just hearing me read something that you wrote like years ago? What's that like?
It's funny. I mean, that's a dense passage. As you were reading through it, I'm thinking, yep, it all makes sense. But I think, well, there's an awful lot packed into that sentence.
Yeah.
But I think and it's nice to hear it read back. It's nice. You talked about when you initially asked me about myself. You referred to me as a writer, and it's true. That's become a big part of my life.
Right.
And writing, you sit there with a pen or whatever, a typewriter, whatever, and put things down. And it's in the very meaning of that practice that someone else is supposed to read it, And so as you're writing, other people are there, but they're there as a sort of thing you're projecting and imagining.
Yeah.
And so it is very interesting then to you're asking what it's like to have you read back my words to me. It is very interesting and very satisfying to find out that someone else read those words. And it's a special thing about the world of print that like, so now we're talking sort of face to face. We're talking on the computer, but we're actually talking like people in real time and so on.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that we have had a weird sort of conversation before, though neither of us had ever met, right? Yeah. In that I sort of sent out a message and you picked up on it, and it's such an interesting thing as a writer to live in that world where you're talking to people you don't know, but you really are trying to talk with real people. You just don't know who they are. And then other people read your work and they are talking to you, although they don't know you either. It's a very interesting reality, but that's what one is in a way choosing to do. I mean, I suppose it's true with people who record music too. They make a record and they want other people to listen and like it. You don't know who those people are, but the fulfillment comes with other people who connect with you, but without actually knowing you or without actually encountering you. It's very, very interesting. Anyway, that's just riffing a little bit in response to your question about having you read it back. But about the quotation itself, yeah, I think one of the ways that I've really come to think about being a person that I find to be continuingly provocative and productive for my thinking is to sort of notice about ourselves how we are always situated at a kind of it's not exactly an intersection, but this sort of intertwining of two things, for lack of a better word, which is that there are meaningful things being revealed to us. There's a world, you see a world, there's stuff outside you, or there's music, you hear a compelling piece of music, you've never heard it before, but you're like, oh, there's something really great happening there, right? So just in that sort of everyday sense, we live with interesting stuff unfolding in ways that grip us. So that's a sense of, sort of something out there that's bigger than us, sort of speaking to us. But it's also the case that whatever grasp we have of that world, of those other meanings, has to come out of me being here in this tiny little organism or this tiny little space or whatever, and so we're always at this intersection of the sort of specificity of ourselves, the specificity on the one hand in the sort of organic sense of just having these fingers and this mouth that's making these sounds right now, and then in the more developed sense of the specificity of our family histories, or the history of what we've practiced. Like I learned English, some other child grew up learning Arabic or Gujarati or something. So the whatever grasp we end up having of those sort of compelling things that present themselves to us are also ways of engaging and taking up and drawing on the resources that come from our very specific and finite histories and bodies and so on. And it's that intersection is what our experience is, and that's who we are. We are that sort of point of those things coming together. And I find that a continuingly rich understanding of ourselves to explore the ways in which our specificity and finitude is provides the medium for our experience and our resources for dealing with it, and also the way in which we are nonetheless not locked into that finitude. But on the contrary, that finitude is what makes it possible for this big world to present us and draw us out into further things. And so again, going back to your earlier remark about the vulnerable child, like it's kind of like on one side there's this intense specificity and dependency, which is very finite. It's all specific. It's just this body, these people, and so on. But what that opens out to is infinite. Like sticking with the musical example, like songs are kind of infinite. Like there's somebody played this thing, and it's this amazing musical experience that you can have and everybody else can have, and it can inspire you to further things. Like music is something that's always going kind of like that, opening up more and more and more to you. So that's kind of what I mean by infinite. Like we're confronted with these things that are inexhaustible in their what they offer, and that infinitude is coupled in our experience with this irreducibly finite, unremovably finite character of ourselves. And that it's just that linking of the openness and closedness, or infinitude and finitude in our experience, I find I find really rich, and I find it very educational to keep exploring that.
Yeah. So that, is it fair to say, so what you're saying is this, that there's, that our, what is most concrete and specific, right? What is most constraining in our humanness, including our body. In fact, our bodies, I mean, I really get the sense, you can really hear Ponte, who articulated this, that the body is this lived tension in some sense, right? Of the particular in this way that also that very particularity in some sense reveals or discloses something like the inexhaustible or the infinite, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like in some sense, it's like I get the sense of like in some sense they kind of like the infinite or the inexhaustible is kind of haunted. We're haunted with it.
Yeah.
But it's also, we realize it in our very constraints, right? And that in some sense you're saying like it, so God, it's so meaningful.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
it's like, it's so meaningful.
But there's nowhere else you can go to experience those things. You don't get to step outside of your body. You don't get to step outside of your life. You don't get to step outside of your culture and your language. Like that's where you are. One thing you said when you were talking about Plato, which I very much agree with, is you were saying, you know, people often talk about the forms, and I don't have much sympathy for the way people talk about those things, but they imagine some world somewhere else. And you were saying that what you saw in my work was an attempt to say, you know, those things are here, and that's exactly how I think of it. I think just picking up on this language I was just using of kind of the intertwining of finite and infinite, you could just put the words here and there in place of finite and infinite, right? That
you're there, right?
You can't ever not be here.
Yeah.
But the amazing thing is that in our here, it's kind of there appears like there's the reality that is bigger than ourselves and that is beyond ourselves. Is alive for us here and now,
right?
And so you can, you know, a couple of things that you could sort of do wrong. You could imagine that there's somewhere else to go, you know, be so fascinated with the idea of there, but imagine that you're going to leave here, and so that would be a way of sort of turning your back on your own specificity, and for that reason being blind to the only site where anything's ever going to happen. But you could also make a mistake kind of the other way and think, oh, it's just this, and think and not see the I'll just pick up on another word, sort of the dimensions of transcendence in your own experience, right? The ways in which yes, you're here, but here is the place where big things are calling to you, and you gotta, or you should notice them. I guess I should say, I do want to say you've got to notice them, because I often think of morality like they're not. It's not about an entertainment. It's not like there are some entertaining things you could interest yourself with by thinking about deeper questions. It's more like big issues call upon us. And we should experience our here as the place where we are called upon to answer to big things. And I think morality is is to my mind often the clearest way to remember that you're called upon to be good,
right?
You know, and that call isn't an alien beyond. It's the discovery of what it means to be a person, like in your very specificity. You as a person are able to be connected with the imperative. You got to be good,
right? Totally. And morality in the sense of conscience can be the way that like one of the most direct experiences that we could have of that call.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And also too, that way that I think, you know, what's coming to mind is that way that Heidegger talks about the silent, like the call of conscience is totally silent. It doesn't give you any content, right? It doesn't tell you what to do, but it's this silent. That's so mysterious to me, the way he talks about that. But I get this sense of it seems to be one of the ways Yeah, absolutely. That there's in some way it's like connected. It's connected to the order or the intelligibility of everything that we are dependent on, right? In some sense, right?
Yeah. I published another book a couple of years ago called Sites of Exposure. And that in that book, I actually do take the notion of conscience
Mm,
up, because
mm,
for that exact reason. It seems to me that the experience of conscience is really that place where, in
mm.
sort of in many ways the most direct way, you can experience that sense of being called there,
Yeah,
right here. And
yeah,
it's that linking of the here and there that I really um I'm really animated by. And I
yeah,
think conscience is like that. And I think what you said is exactly right. It's a silent call. It's not
yeah,
like you're going somewhere else where all the answers are,
yeah,
but on the contrary, it's right here in the specificity of your own life.
yeah,
You experience the imperative to realize higher things, to realize the good, to realize infinite things, or to realize beautiful things. I mean, I think that lies behind a lot of art, the experience of the imperative to, like, take the finite stuff of our world and make it profound, make it the way something profound appears.
yeah,
That
yeah,
seems like they're basically the same issue.
yeah. So it's so interesting. I just had this as you're talking. I just this made this connection. I don't think I've ever quite seen it like before. But one of the things, like in the practice of circling, what you see is, it's oftentimes, it's done in groups and has a lot to do with, in some sense, tolerating and sustaining the being seen, right? And
Mhm.
and this kind of practice of this sweet spot, if you will, of opening to another's gaze and risking that kind of exposure, but proactively doing it, um, and being in some sense beheld and seen by the other. But it's in some sense, there's something about that meeting of being seen and seeing that you're being seen by another that I mean, I hear it talked about, you can explain it psychologically, but it doesn't get it into the depth. And I've always wondered about what is it that's so intense about that? Like, it's like you know, we we come together and I'm aware that your gaze, right? And it could be a deeply accepting gaze. In fact, in some sense, it's that very acceptance is a call to disclose myself
Mhm.
or recognize
Yeah.
my own disclosure. But that moment of like, but I never quite really saw it as I just saw it right now about that gaze as being something like the experience of your conscience from the outside, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
In calling out, because what ends up happening, you see it over and over again, is people just start to share. Well, one, they get a lot more access to themselves, right? And they start sharing things and revealing things about themselves. Then in some sense, sometimes it's like a confession, but oftentimes it's kind of this recognition of the depth of their own being that's kind of called out of in an unusual way of confessing this in some sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think uh I like your remark that how did you put it? Something about the experience of the accepting gaze of the other person. um, it's not just a passive thing you receive, but
Yeah,
you kind of receive it as
yeah,
something sort of summoning you to disclose, inviting, but also uh, that's really what you need to do to be able to accept it, is to
yeah,
give something out. And I do think, um, first of all, I think that's a really good description of what it's actually like to feel the gaze of another, right? And it's we have so many ways of talking about things that are easy but misrepresent
yeah,
stuff. And I think that issue of talking about what it's like to be under the gaze of another person is one of the areas where it's most unfortunate that we quickly label it with crappy interpretive notions.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the description you just gave is really good. Like it's amazing how you do experience another person through a gaze, and it has that sense, or can have that sense of acceptance and so on. And that is something that you get in the process of sharing. And what you share, this is another thing you said, I mean, not in your words, but I think this was your point, that what you share isn't a matter of taking a thing you already had and then just putting it out in public, but that activity of sharing is also you discovering those very things about yourself that you're sharing, right? So it's transformative in that sense, right? And so that way in which in dealing with another person, our perception, all those ways in which it's not passive, all those ways in which it's not static, those are the things that I think need to be acknowledged, and your remarks did that quite well, I think. But there's something so alive in dealing with another person. It's almost like, you could almost say that the interaction between people is almost like a living thing, right? It's a thing that has its own dynamism and its own reality, and it can grow. And so it's not so much that there's one person and then another person, and they each contribute something that is made like a little product from their resources. It's more like two people have the capacity to kind of enter into this thing that becomes a bigger reality than either of them. Draws things out of them, redefines them, and so on. I think intersubjective relations are extremely alive in that sense, and transformative, and so I think the thing you would, sorry, go ahead.
They're almost like living symbols, enacting. It's like concentrated. The whole thing seems to be so concentrated right there. And they're places where new things happen. People have things come out of them that neither of them knew were inside them. Right.
And they're amazing. It's amazing.
Yes. And the experience of that newness is just absolutely so. It's like it's ecstatic in the literal sense.
It is, exactly.
Right? Standing out while being what I'm standing out from at the same time, getting this kind of deeper glimpse. And it's funny, as we're talking about this, I'm wondering about, like, because I've often wondered about, like, in my own work in circling, there's this kind, there's these word formations that come out of the practice that I'm like, what is that really saying, right? And one of them is this experience that people have called, they just usually say, God, I feel deeply seen, right? Mm-hmm. This kind of, and I thought about, like, well, okay, so what makes that not, what's the difference between being deeply seen and being, say, narcissistically reified? And I'm getting this, I've had this sense about it, right? And it's clearly there is, but, like, in what way is that different? And I just had this sense of, I would imagine in narcissistic reification, if you will, there's something I show up with already trying to get you to see me, right? Exactly. So, and actually when you see me, you're just reflecting something that I'm already needing and know that I need to have in itself. So it's actually a closing in, if anything, right? But what we're talking about is actually almost the opposite of that. It's like,
very much,
what I'm saying is, like, when I feel deeply seen is, it's like something like, I find myself revealed in a relation with you that I am more than I knew to ever even say through our interaction, right?
Exactly. Yep. And I think that's exactly right. And so the sort of thing we're talking about, I mean, there are a number of familiar places where it really does come up and where it matters. And, a very obvious one, I think, is therapeutic settings. That's this thing we're describing is what you really want to have happen in relationship with your psychiatrist or whatever. And sometimes it does, often it doesn't. But that's what really does happen in rich transformative therapy. It's what happens in teaching. in
Yeah.
good relationships of teachers and students. It certainly is what happens in good, romantic or erotic relationships, intimate personal pairings. Like there are lots of places where I suppose it probably should happen also, and does happen in good, parenting and whatever the opposite is, parenting and childing relationships. I mean, there are lots of these places where that are sort of about the issue of people seeing each other and making a new reality happen. And they shouldn't be confused with each other. There's therapy, parenting, love relationships. What's the other one I gave? Teaching. They are all a little different, and they have different reasons for existing, different parameters. But I think what they all share is that when they work, they're exactly this thing that you were just describing as sort of deep seeing. Like they are these situations of people who move into some deeper other kind of reality, musical or educational or whatever, through this kind of connecting with each other's gaze or connecting with each other's person. So I think that issue of the unique kind of openness that's to the world and to ourselves that's made possible through intimate personal bonds. I think that's where, that's the powerful thing to investigate. That's the powerful thing to have in our lives. And that's what that book, I think that's a lot of what that book you mentioned, Bearing Witness to Epiphany, I think is about, that what happens in the connection between people.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I'm finding this conversation to be so, especially like what we're talking about right now, so in some sense confirming. I'm like, it's like there's a mystery going on there that like I'm like, it never stops disclosing itself. But what you're saying before about this way in which just to highlight what something specific you said, it's so that when two people come together, it's not just this person and they come with their own resources and then something new happens, but they're already always underway in a context, right? Layers of history, of worldhood, right? All of these levels of context in which when they come together, there's one way where we could say, I come together, I interact with you, and then we develop a relationship. But there's also another way to say it, which is like we come together and in talking with you, we reveal a relationship that in some sense had a certain quality of already being there in the deepest sense of the word. And that already there-ness, because I've always noticed this sense of, when I see my wife over and over and over and over again, and we kind of like meet new moments of like intimacy, or I talk to somebody and there's this kind of moment of contact that's beyond and so the moment. It has this quality of not like a discovery of something new. It's almost like, oh, there you are. Oh, there you were. Like this kind of recognition of something that I can't kind of ontically back up in some kind of factual way, but the felt sense of the truth of that connection seems to reveal a recognition of like, I'm being reminded of something.
Yeah. I mean, people, talk about being kindred spirits, and I think that way of talking really does speak to something in our experience that we do connect with people in a way that makes it seem like, oh, you were already there doing the same thing I was already doing. Neither of us knew it about each other, and maybe neither of us knew it about ourselves.
Right.
But coming together reveals like, oh yeah, we were trying to make our home in the same place already, or we were waiting for the same thing, but didn't know it. I mean, I think that's a very real experience that people have a lot, and it's important for a lot of reasons. I mean, it's an important place to live, to be, but it also is important for revealing that your own thinking about what you said about narcissistic reification and so on, like your own take on yourself, your own stories about yourself are not they're not the last word. They're not automatically authoritative, right? There are things about ourselves
nearly as interesting as you think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
There are things about ourselves we just don't know, and we find ourselves,
Yes.
which is interesting. Like we find ourselves sort of inward often by finding someone else. It's through that other person that
Yeah.
who we are can sort of be revealed to us as well
Right.
as to others.
Right. It is really kind of interesting. I've noticed, I think a lot of people have this experience when they first get into a romantic relationship with somebody, and there's that whole process of like getting to know each other's lives. Oftentimes how they get to know is they talk about all of their past relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like all the other marriages they've had. And I think and you can get that sense in which the thing that kind of develops us is this kind of relationality, right?
Right.
It's so we just can't separate ourselves from that. Well,
Yeah, and another interesting thing there is in not in all ways, but in some ways, you're a different person in different relationships. The very person you're able to be can't really be separated from the person you're hooked together with. That's kind of interesting too, that you need other people to be yourself, but also who you are sort of shaped by what that human reality is through which you come to be sort of revealed and developed.
You're right. I'm different. I'm a different guy in some way when it's just me and my mom versus when it's me and my mom and my dad.
Yeah, right.
And like vice versa. There are these ways that it kind of calls something out or reveals something. Yeah, it's like this sense of, we are never a finished product. In fact, you say this in this other part, and you're talking about the body. Number 2, you say, the bodily character of sense indicates that we always exist in a state of tension, charged between inauguration and resolution, and that our perception will always be a matter of action, of doing. I love that way of that just being a body, how I hear that is being an embodied being. In other words, I hear that is like to get the depth of this. It's like, I'm not a body that then is intention.
Mm-hmm.
My body is already always that which finds itself embodying these intentions, right? It is this enactment of this embodiment. And so this kind of feeling of, the family systems folks talk about intimacy is a function of the ability to tolerate anxiety, which is really interesting about this. Like because I've sensed this about, there's something going on in intimacy that seems, it's also going on in something, what it is to be successful or to create something new. There's this relationship to anxiety that if you can kind of tolerate it, move into it. And the way the family systems people talk about it is that what that anxiety is that, if we say that there's like we're a bullseye. If I'm a circle, I'm like concentric circles of layers. And as we get to know each other, right, each level of getting to know each other is going through another level of intimacy. And at these moments of intimacy make us anxious, right? Because what they would say is they bring into crisis, in some sense, this paradox of that on one level, my deepest instinct is to merge with everything good and to belong with everything. And at the same time, I want to stand out and realize my uniqueness and my individuality. And oftentimes, like moments of intimacy with somebody else are usually these things of where, I'm realizing what's true for me. If I say it, I'm afraid you'll go away. Or if I say it, I'm afraid that you'll reject me. Or I say it, I'm afraid we're going to lose this belonging. So I may move away from that anxiety by, like maybe by dominating the situation or by submitting or by dissociating or something. but when I stand right in the center of that, in some sense, it's these deep moments of authenticity, because I think what makes it authentic is it's realizing this kind of tension that you're talking about, right? Of where, and usually what happens is in the act of saying it and courageously saying it and making that risk, that's so transformative of me and usually of the other person, that it opens up a whole new world that I couldn't even know to be afraid of or even to want, right? So there's these moments of intimacy that seem to inaugurate these tensions, right?
Yeah. Yeah, let me just think about that for a second. Yeah, I mean, just thinking of the story you were just telling about sort of increasing intimacy.
Yeah.
There are different, I guess there are different, the kind of anxiety can come up in different ways, because as you say, on the one hand, you have to sort of be brave to let someone get to know you, because you might lose them. They might discover they don't like what they see or something. So there's that kind of anxiety. But the other thing is, when you do go through that, you're not quite the same person on the other side of it. Like when you develop an intimate relationship with someone, that disclosing of yourself is also the launching of a new world. And so that's not just a static thing either, right? Suddenly you're in this new world, and there's the anxiety of now, saying goodbye to a former identity and accepting to embark on this thing with all the stuff that happens there, so I think there's kind of the whole experience of intimacy is sort of fraught with anxiety, because I suppose because it's always an issue of sort of putting who you are sort of at stake, and you're risking being rejected. You're also risking being changed, you're risking getting involved in a big new thing. And so it's all about not being able to rest on comfortable established things. So intimacy is, in that way, intimacy is threatening. It's premised on not allowing those established things to just stay there. So it makes sense that there's that it's challenging in those different ways. And just picking up on your remark about inauguration, that connecting with someone intimately is really accepting to embark on something with them. Because just as we were talking before about, someone's accepting gaze isn't just something you receive passively, but it's received in the act of sharing. Well, it's a similar sort of thing. Developing intimacy with someone isn't a matter of settling a fixed fact. It's a matter of now launching something you have to do and you have to enact. And that can be quite scary.
And it's funny, there's even another paradox I just noticed, as you're talking. On one level, it can be extremely disruptive of those things that felt holding and in some sense stabilizing. However, oftentimes it's it disrupts it in such a way that in some sense makes me, and I don't know, it's renews whatever it is that holds me in a much deeper, profound way. So it's an interesting dichotomy of, on one level, I'm really anxious and I could lose the farm here, and right. But in doing that, stepping into and tolerating that risk is also what affords, in another sense, an even maybe deeper level of safety, because I kind of know, I think I start to, it's funny, as we're talking about getting this sense of, I somehow get, it tutors my awareness of what it is to be a self, right? Which is I am the self. And I think you talk about it. I am that being for which is always already beyond itself, right? I am that being that is the being that can transform itself over and over and over again.
I mean, the thing is,
the deep security in that, and solace as well, right?
But it's an interesting kind of, you used the word knowledge and you talked about tutoring, and those things are right. But it is an interesting kind of knowledge, because it's also under another description, it's a kind of hope and a kind of faith. Like when you're if you're getting to know yourself as a certain kind of open thing,
Yeah.
that's the same as getting secure with a certain kind of insecurity. Like if you're settling into a sense of yourself as open, you're settling into a sense of yourself as someone for whom things are not going to be settled. So I think it's just important to remember that character of just of that same word, of the openness of the kind of relationship we're talking about here, of the idea that you're accepting something that brings with it a notion of change, development. You don't quite know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so there again, talking about sort of the anxiety and so on, like when you get involved in an intimate relationship with another person, whether it's a love partner or a therapist or a teacher, you connect with that person because you feel a certain confidence that it's the right thing. So that's the security. But it is also, you're sort of having, something's happening, and you're sort of having to have faith that I hope this is a good thing. I hope where we're going is right. Because there's a kind of blindness.
Yeah.
There's a kind of seeing, which is in that confidence. But there's a kind of blindness to those things where you don't quite know what's coming.
Yeah.
And that's a psychologically demanding thing to accept.
Right. Yeah. And it's like it seems like how it's also what develops us, right, too, and our defensiveness. So funny. It's like there's that quality, I think, as A.H. almost talks about, like as he goes into that phrase of from Jesus, the meek shall inherit the earth, right? He's like, how do you get at that? He's like, well, like if you think about a kind of vulnerability is also a transparency, right, to deeper and deeper levels of reality. And the paradox is that like the more transparent you are to the deeper and deeper levels of reality, that at the level of something like the Godhead, right, or the level of something like the good, right, to realize that is in some sense beyond vulnerability. So this like vulnerability, opening to vulnerability in these ways that we're talking about is also leads paradoxically to an invulnerability of what you open yourself to. And that the paradox is that like, and the way he would put it is like, yeah, and most of us are not that interested in being human. We'd rather put like a shell around ourselves. But the paradox is the moment I put a shell around myself is the moment I become brittle.
Yeah.
Right. In that sense.
Yeah, that's right.
So one of the things I wanted just to touch on with you, I was looking through your channel, and it's funny, I didn't know that you had a YouTube channel until somebody I coach, do one-on-one work with, I sent them your book, and she's like, oh, so I was like, oh, I've actually listened to you on YouTube. I didn't realize it was it was you. I didn't make the connection. But last night when I was just thinking about this interview and looking through some of your videos and stuff, I came across a video. I think it was made by a former student, and it was about your seminars. That it sounds like, I think it's like you've been doing these summer intensive seminars, like are a week long or something. And what was really interesting about it is that as people were describing that experience of it, I really got this sense of like, as they were talking about what they communicated to me anyways, like I was like, oh, wow, they found that really, really deeply transformative, right? In so many ways. And there's this, and I think it brings together a lot. And I just wanted to touch on this with you because I think in everything that we've just discussed has also been touching on this. But I hear in that something I don't hear talked about much, right? which is one, how philosophy, genuinely encountering philosophy, um, can be so deeply personally transformative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also communal, right?
Yep.
And doing that together is this deep kind of relationship, um, that they, I think, were really expressing, right, in all their ways, right, in all the different ways that they said it. They were really expressing, like, yeah, kind of life was one way, and then we spent this week, and I walked out, and life was really different ever since, right, in that sense. And I hear what I heard is that a lot of it, they spoke, a lot of it had to do with this relationship, thinking together, of going into a text together.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah. What's
Um,
that experience been like for you? And
well, I think it sort of picks up on that earlier discussion about Plato. There's a way people say things that I think are kind of silly about these things they call Platonic forms that exist somewhere. I mean, I don't really know what people think they're saying when they say that, but I don't think it has that much to do with Plato. But and as you say, I've been more interested in trying to show how those issues are alive right here. It's not about some other stuff somewhere else. Well, I think that same point applies to a lot of other stuff we're talking about too. Like, I'm thinking about your remark about setting up a shell and becoming brittle and so on. Philosophy as a whole, people often study as if it were something in some other world, as some kind of, I suppose, intellectual exercise to think about those things. But they imagine they're studying some kind of polished gems or something sitting somewhere else in some magical place. Whereas on the contrary, I don't think the study of philosophy is the study of anything other than those most pressing issues that are confronting you this moment in your life and in your world. And so I think you were talking about my summer seminar. I think one of the things that happens there, like, yeah, I usually get about 20 or 25 people to come together for a week, graduate students or faculty members in philosophy, professional people who do it professionally, but we get together and read philosophy books, a philosophy book, a great book together for a week. And reading that book isn't a matter of studying some polished gem in some other world. It's reading that book is partially the occasion for the people to form a kind of community, but the book also inspires us to think better than we ever would otherwise. But what it's inspiring us to think about is the world we actually live in and the lives we actually live. And so I think that really is the issue. It's like philosophy really is learning to appreciate better what's going on around you. And the way that really works is by not having a sort of nicely polished thought, but by actually connecting with people and by actually connecting with the world. So I don't think of philosophy as a detached intellectual thing. I think of philosophy as a transformative relationship to your situation. And so I think that's really what that seminar has been for me. It's been a thing that's gone on for many years now of connecting with a changing group of people. So it's not always the same people every year, but there's a sort of a core of people who have come. It's connecting with a community in that sense, where we together educate ourselves, partially by drawing on the great resources of the philosophical tradition, partially by, or significantly by, relying on our trust in each other's abilities, not just in the sense that we think other people are smart, but which is surely true too, but trusting in the other person's ability to take these things seriously, so it's by each of us being vulnerable in some of the ways we were talking about, right? It's by each of us in the group saying, okay, I'm really going to do philosophy now. I'm going to be committed to this thing and trust that you're going to be committed to, and that we're working on this thing together. It's it's because people are going to bring their greatest efforts to make this a serious event, to take things seriously together and cooperate with each other to try to think about reality with each other through the guidance of these texts. Like that leads us all, I think, to learn. It changes our relationship to the world, changes our relationship to our own lives. But it is then hard, it's impossible to separate this new vibrant way of thinking about things. You can't really separate that from the connection with these people. So I think for me and for the other people in that group, I think we've all felt that we've really done philosophy, which means we've really learned to think more deeply and in transformative ways about our lives through working together and thinking together collectively. So no, that's no doubt that was a bit of a rambly answer, but I think that speaks to some of what you were asking about.
Yeah, totally. I just feel the through line, like just in what you're saying about what I'm gathering about the sensibility that I'm appreciating of philosophy, of first reading Plato, and especially that Plato, that's, I would imagine he could have just wrote out a bunch of propositions, but he wrote dialogues, right?
Yeah.
And like there's something I think that the form that it takes is exemplary and says so much about it, maybe even in some sense, in a greater sense of what explicitly is discussed in the dialogue. There's so much going on there. And so just kind of feeling the through line between that and then your instinct to create these intensives with people where you grapple in that way. Yeah,
I think that's right. And talking with you about that is helping me to see the through line too. Like I think, these things I'm doing are more unified and connected than I had realized in some cases.
Yeah. So that just like right there, that like little instantiation of an insight, of making a connection. So I speak back to what I'm seeing in your life, right? And you make that connection. In some sense, you didn't see something new. You saw something that already was, but gathered in more explicitly. Would you say that like that instance of seeing that is something like hearing or touching in on the form?
Yeah, I guess so. I think
some kind of eidos or a through line or what's gathering.
Yeah. I mean, I think what happens is first of all, I like that language of making something implicit explicit. I think that's a big part of what development is.
Yeah.
And so that does very often mean you were living in a wash of different things, but you now see how they are sort of unified. And so that is, in that sense, that the gathering of them is the recognition that they were the appearing of a single thing, or they were the kind of appearing of a form. So I think that's right. I think it's seeing a kind of form that was already active.
Yeah.
You weren't recognizing it as such, but you were living in it.
Yeah.
But that act of recognition then can be transformative, right? When you recognize it, it changes your sense of what you're doing, and it gives you a possibility of moving into new things and so on. Like, again, just think of it as a romance. Like, you might have spent a lot of time with a person, and the insight might be that you might share, we should really be together.
Yeah.
And that's not just coming up with a novel idea. It is in a certain way recognizing, we were actually already doing something. There was a something there. Right?
Yeah.
But that recognition is part of the development of that form too. Like, if you didn't make that recognition, it would never really gel.
Yeah.
But so the act of you both recognizing it together is essential to it being able to really pull itself together. And
Yeah.
then once that's happened, you're in a new situation where you can do new things.
Right.
You have a new relationship and you live from that and you build from it into a new life.
Right.
So I think that's kind of a good model for recognition of form. You were asking, is this recognition of form? I think, yeah, I think that's kind of what it's like.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like that through, because it's the eidos. I'd love to have you like have it. We'll get together and, like, if you're open to it, to have a conversation with John and Chris about this thing that John, a term John's come up with, he's called it a Platonic no, eidetic eduction.
Mm-hmm.
This sense of kind of educing out, like that through line. And it's so paradoxical, right? Because it's the essence of paradoxical, because, and that's the thing I've learned through these conversations that I've just appreciated, which is usually when people think about form, they think of a shape. But like letting that go and then starting to consider the form, something opens up that I think is more the livingness of it. And what's in kind of the sense is that there's how I know something is, this is my understanding, is usually if you ask me what a lamp is or what my girlfriend is or what that is I'll list you a bunch of the aspects of it. But that's not actually like what I know, like, because I can't reduce the thing into its aspect. But its form is something like that which gathers all the aspects together into intelligibility, but yet is not itself another aspect, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's something my sense is like when I read the Platonic dialogues, I have this sense of like what we're doing in this kind of dialectical form. We're getting closer and closer to educing out that thing that can't be an object, but what grants objects as objects, right? And getting closer and closer to that.
Yeah, it's a good description. I want to pick up on one remark you made. Yeah, I do think that when people hear words like, or hear the word form, they often do think of shape, which is quite misleading. I often am more inclined to rely on the expression life form, because I feel like that's a kind of idiom people use, and they know what that means.
Yeah.
But when you say a life form or a form of life, you don't think of a shape. You think of something different. You think of like if someone says, the form of life in whatever 20th century, well, maybe that's too big. It's not. I was going to say 20th century North America. That might be too big. But you can think of the life form of or whatever it would be, a New Yorker, or you can think of the life form of a rose bush. When you think of those things, or you can think of the life form of, you might say, of a peasant or a rich woman. Those are names of forms, but you don't think of a shape when you say those things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You think of a kind of meaningful reality that only exists as a very varied and dynamic process.
Yeah.
But in that whole thing, there is a kind of unity of sense, but it's not another, as you say, it's not another aspect. It's not another sensible thing. It's the very meaning that grants the possibility of all those things, and it's what is the sort of rationale of their holding together and so on. Anyway, I just wanted to pick up on that idea. I do think that thinking of a life form is often a helpful sort of word game you can play with yourself.
That's nice.
So as not to come up with the wrong associations with that word form.
Right. Because I feel there's a sense in which what's exciting to me about this is, in some sense, like discovering and explicating. It has this quality of like looking at what's revealed in Plato and Socrates and Heidegger and all, is this sense of like, oh, I've smelt that this whole time. In fact, it's been what I've been interested in and I'm discovering what was already the case but unexplicit. Whatever that process is, feels like it feels like a deeper and deeper intimacy, or getting closer with, well, actually, in some sense, it feels, and this is, I want to ask you about this too, because you talk a lot about reality, right? In a very, very dynamic way. Because it does feel like it those experiences, how do I put this? Has the world or reality reveal, there are little moments where it feels like the reality shows itself as a thou, right? Like in some sense of revealing what was already, I was already in relationship and I'm recognizing it. There's something about that. I didn't consciously understand it, but I was being it in some sense, and then seeing it. Are these little instances where it feels like that through line, or the life form opens up, and it's so fortifying, right? It's like the opposite of humiliation. Right?
Yeah.
It's like it's a profound dehumiliation of being alive, or something like that. Something so profound just speaks. And what's interesting about it is you can't reify it. It's slippery that way, right? You can like kind of, it seems like it's something you can get closer and closer to, but it part of it withdraws in you, in coming closer, but in a way that draws you into it. And I would say, as you reveal it, it discloses you, right? As it discloses you in such a way that affords you to disclose it more. This mutual through line, or this form is revealed. And there's something about that, whereas as I'm talking about it now, God, just seems like this is what, like, all the mystics were doing, right? Like the Christian, especially like the Neoplatonic Christian mystics, right? This kind of sense of the invisible that substantiates and gathers the visible, the logos gathering, showing itself, and the recognition of that. In some sense, it seems like this, especially in our time, right, where we're kind of in a way where, whether or not people realize it or not, like people really have an understanding of reality that's quite nihilistic, right? And there's something about that so personal about this way of comporting or revealing the world, that feels like it's access. It's like it gets access to a sense of meaningfulness that doesn't betray our rational sensibilities. In fact, it kind of, it's underneath it. So I'm noticing, I want to keep celebrating it and talking about it and bringing it out.
Yeah.
Right?
I think what you said is good. I mean, I sympathize with all those things. And I think I'm brought back again to think about the experience of conscience. It seems to me that is the place where the thing you just described is what we're experiencing. And I liked your language about humiliation. It's interesting. In the experience of conscience, there's a sense in which you feel yourself called. Yeah. And that's very much like your sense of the encounter with a thou. You know, there's a sense that reality's, talking with you or calling upon you. It's not that you run into another person exactly, but there's a weight of imperative that where you would be lying about things if you said, "Oh, reality's just not like that." Yeah. That wouldn't be a correct statement. That would be an attempt to deny your conscience. You'd be sort of trying to conceal something. Yeah. So anyway, conscience has that kind of character, and but when that experience is not humiliation by any means. Yeah. Right. Because conscience precisely calls upon you in the experience of conscience. You're feeling called upon to be the one who is responsible to go do the right thing. Yeah. So it's, in that sense, it's very empowering and endorsing of you, the opposite of humiliating. Yeah. But then I think of another word that sounds like humiliating, but sort of means the opposite. It's also a experience of great humility, because in the experience of conscience, you're not thinking, oh, I can do whatever I want. You're really feeling answerable, right? And you're feeling like there's something more than just what I say that has to be answered to. So I often like to think about the difference between humiliation and humility. They obviously are rooted in the same sorts of notions, but that means something very different to be humbled in that sense of being made to bow down versus to be humbled in the sense of realizing you're not the ultimate thing. So I think conscience is a really powerful experience, is the powerful experience of recognizing that challenging relationship we have to reality. That we both have to recognize I am not the last word. But that doesn't mean you're inessential. On the contrary, you are called personally to contribute. You got to participate in the making of this world. So I think conscience is a profound experience of figuring out where we are in relationship to reality. I think it's reflecting on those relationships, I think, that very greatly informs how I write and think about things.
I think I just got the sense of, I think I asked you in the email, like as an example question I may ask was like, what's calling to you? Like, it's funny, it's like after this whole conversation and then asking myself that question now, it just rings differently. It just rings a lot richer, right? So I also heard in some sense, what I just heard there was too, is that conscience isn't just the sense of like, this haunting sense of I've done something bad or I'm off, but it's actually the kind of I heard is like the ontological tension to in some sense draws me to create.
Exactly. Yeah, right? I think so.
Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. And therefore, I mentioned this book, Sites of Exposure. I go pretty directly from talking about conscience to talking about artistic creation. Like I think, in other words, exactly as you've just said, there's a very close link between that sort of primarily, this thing we think of as a primarily sort of moral experience,
right,
and this thing we think of as, this very creative artistic thing. It's a very strong link there, I think. Connection. I think they're both about grappling. They're both about feeling the imperative to use your personal resources sort of in the purest way you can to express what's true, something like that.
Totally. And in some sense, saying yes to it is the creative act in all the different ways that we can do that, right? In your case, like writing and music and this kind of saying yes to it. And I was curious about what you think about this, because one of the things, a distinction that I've been, it seems to be something that like I find myself thinking about a lot, is this distinction between exposure and vulnerability, right? Like in some sense, exposure, I would imagine, it's like, so exposure has that sense of like, it's usually what traumatizes us, like you're in the playground and somebody pulls down our pants and like we're just exposed to humiliation and the elements, right? And vulnerability has a call to it. It has like, it seems like it's more like vulnerability seems to imply more of a voluntarily moving towards, right? And sometimes I am exposing myself, but there's a sense in which I've said yes to it, right? I'm opening myself up in some way, right?
You're thinking of it from the inside. I often think of it also from the outside of how other people deal with it. So I think in profound ways we are exposed. We are vulnerable, which means like you can't help it. It's not optional that you're going to go out and be subject to other people and subject to the world, right?
Right.
But so that's our ontological condition. And so from the outside, it matters that people care for our vulnerabilities. And so there's or so if I use the word exposure, like there's then those sort of two senses. Ontologically, we're exposed. And often that means we need people not to deal with that by exposing us. Like you can be pushed too hard to be confronted with the things that you're vulnerable to, right? And so other people need to care for and in a sense protect our vulnerabilities,
right?
And then from the inside, as you say, I think we need to allow them. We need to say yes to them. And it's that whether or not we can say yes to them comfortably often depends, maybe always depends, on whether other people are respecting them or trusting them. And so I think the problems come when we can't really consent to lead with our vulnerabilities because other people won't treat them carefully. So I think there's a real dialogue between whether you say yes or no and whether other people acknowledge or not.
So there's I can feel that the developmental sense of that, of getting a sensibility for this. Because it's often that's the case. It's like people get really, like if you're a kid and like you get beaten by your parents or like, which I've had a lot of that kind of stuff in my past, I would say that like so much of resolving or working through that has been about in some sense being open to exposing myself and then finding those places that actually fit in that. You're right. There is this kind of, the both are really, really true in this essential way, but the discernment in that seems like developmental, or something that can go, has a quality of a subtlety or an intuition or a breadth of maybe a wisdom. One can become wise at discerning.
I think very much so. I think we do have to learn how to be vulnerable, in healthy ways, and that comes through a history of dealing with your vulnerabilities and exploring them. And it will work well if that history is a good one. It works well if you've had a history of being treated well by others in the discovery and exploration of those things. And on the contrary, if you've been treated poorly, it's pretty hard to venture into that domain.
That's kind of, well, I guess this is kind of brings it full circle to what we were talking about with your father, right? And like, in some sense, I've often thought about like the therapeutic relationship, right? In many ways is probably one of the ways that like living philosophia, right, really does take place in that way that is transformative. But I know that a lot of that's predicated on what they call, what is it, like transference and countertransference, that sense of where you bond with the therapist that's also bonding with all of the past unresolved things. And the therapist is in some sense, you're both co-weaving this place of, because it's not them, right? They can then risk, and the therapist can kind of meet that risk with vulnerability and start to actually kind of come to some kind of resolution with that, right, in a big way. So I didn't really quite ever saw it quite like that with this as a result of this conversation.
And I think what you said is really good. And I think, I mentioned before, I was talking about intimate relationships, and I mentioned teacher, student, parent and child, therapist, and one other one, I don't remember what the other one was, but what you just said is an important one for helping to see the strong similarities of those relationships, but also why they're a little different. Like why you don't want therapy to be you talking to a machine. Like good therapy is going to involve developing a kind of intimate personal bond.
Yeah.
It's got exactly. And that's where the therapeutic power comes from. But though it's intimately related to a relationship to a parent, you shouldn't just confuse it with that.
Yeah.
And though it's intimately related to a love relationship, you shouldn't just confuse it with that.
Yeah.
But I think that there are all kinds of strong institutional reasons and other things, like to want to insist too rigidly on the difference between those things.
Yeah.
So that we don't see that what they all share, going back to this issue of form and so on, what they all share is the power of parenting, the power of love, the power of therapy, all are rooted in that establishing of a connection between people that is laced with vulnerability and should be. So you can't have a good relationship if it's not also one where there's a risk of trouble happening too, and so when you try to institutionally say these relationships must be alienated, institutional, and all the rest, that keeps some problems from happening for sure. But it also removes from them the very possibility of having transformative power.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of brings us back again in another circling around here, and then we'll start to bring the conversation to a closure. I think we've been going for a couple hours now. This has been great, by the way. Really enjoying getting to know you, and like many moments of what I'd say is like from dialectic into dialogos, kind of moments where it just felt like something was actually beyond. I felt myself having thoughts and saying things and hearing things that were beyond what I knew, or I could do by myself.
So that's what conversation should do.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of that, and maybe we can talk about this at another time too. It's funny, especially considering everything we just talked about and about like, God, yeah, it does seem that like intimacy and vulnerability and this relationship between exposure and vulnerability and the platonic forms and being open to that and getting closer to that, and how that deeply grants our ability to find a deeply embodied, meaningful life and to live out those tensions, right? And how it's all it's relationship all the way down, right? Like it's just like relationship all the way down. And to then think about kind of the technological age that we're in right now. And we talked a little bit about this earlier before I think I started recording. As one of the things that I've realized that why circling, which is a kind of, you could say is like a meditative, like a intersubjective yoga, if you will. It's like practicing just that intimacy of fellowship and deepening our capacities of listening and speaking and attunement and all those things. Why it took off, and just on its own, despite the personalities that discovered it, right? I think I've come to realize it is that in some sense it's revealing of the relationship that we have to relationship now, in that sense that technology has, for the first time, and of course, whenever you change the structure of communication, like it historically just changes everything, right? And I think something that I don't hear talked about that much specifically, but I think it's actually it's a radically big deal. And it just happened 15 years ago, where at some point life required or necessitated so many conversations. Like if we need to just exchange the most simplest information, we would at least have to talk on the phone, right? And then technology comes along and it starts with the answering machine, but then it goes into text and email and all the iterations, right? To where we have a situation where all of a sudden we can uncut, like what's uncoupled is is the commune, right, from vacation, if you will. Like
Yeah,
the we can exchange information without having to go through the awkward, ambiguously filled thing called relatedness. And as
I
we've talked
agree.
about it, it's those very relationships that account for, constitute who we are, right, in such a way.
Yeah,
So making
I
that an
agree.
option and considering that relationship is just, right, exposes me every time to all of my vulnerabilities that I'd rather like not, if I have a choice, I'm of course just going to drift towards the easiest part. And so I just think that one of the things that people have really been drawn to about circling is and although it hasn't been they wouldn't explicitly talk about this, I think the underlying sense is that it's rarer and rarer for genuine contact, right?
Yeah,
Increasingly so, right? We have all kinds of connections, but we're now living in a time in history which is so weird, and it's so weird that it doesn't occur as weird. That's the weirdest part.
yeah.
Like
No, I agree with
literally
you.
all I need is an internet connection and I can like start a company, become famous, like become a millionaire, like become well known, and never have to actually make contact with anybody. Like that's actually possible now. Right. And so
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think you're right, and I think that's it's a pretty terrifying thing about contemporary digital technology
yeah,
is exactly that. It produces a kind of veneer of communication, while in fact removing
yeah,
all real interaction between people for exactly the reason you gave. Like it takes away the space of vulnerability and awkwardness, and it basically turns communication into information, and those are not the same thing.
no,
And
no,
it's that's a pretty barren human world, and it's and I like your remark about the answering machine. I've had the same thought. There's a something started there, and it looked kind of innocent and helpful with
yeah,
the answering machine. And now I think, wow,
yeah,
all all uh, all life suddenly becomes talking to an answering machine. Basically,
yeah,
it's very distressing. So I think you're completely right about that, and I think you're probably right about that. Uh, Making a number of things seem important and popular, like but basically people, there's something really missing in people's lives, and they're going to benefit from places where they can actually connect. So I
yeah,
think there is you talked about a crisis of meaning, and I think that there's a crisis of human meaning, in people's lives.
right.
So anyway, I'm just agreeing with you. I think the things you said are right. I'm trying to actually write about that right now. There's a book I'm working on, and I'm trying to write exactly about that, about the sort of impact of the computer world on our
Yeah.
what should be interpersonal communication, but it's the interpersonal part
Oh,
that's
wow.
disappearing. I think it's a big deal.
Oh, wow. So you have your finger right on that too. Yeah.
Yep, that's I think that's the issue right now. I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. And it's funny. I just don't hear people. I hear people address
No,
it, but not address it in with the ontological
exactly,
sense, right?
exactly.
That's really I don't know, the danger of better or worse. Who knows what's going to happen with it? But like, it's just bizarrely uncanny. And it's created such, I think part of the reason maybe we're not seeing it is that I notice, so I'm Generation X, and so we're the last generation that were adults before, like
Yeah,
basically the
right,
internet came,
right.
right? And now we're starting to see the very beginning of the first adults that were raised, right, without that don't have a memory before the internet.
Yeah,
and
right.
and it's funny because like, I've done some of the work that I've also done is I'll go and in circling is I'll work with families, and I'll go and move in with them for like a couple of weeks or a month and just kind of embed myself in the family and work with it as it comes up. And I've learned more about reality doing that than almost anything.
Yep.
But it's through that where I've really started to see that, like, I'm seeing a lot of the children what is real for them is what's online.
Yeah.
What's not real, right, are the relationships and living reality, right? Like literally, I had one kid, and this is also symptomatic of other things, but but the way it expressed itself was he would go to school and he wouldn't talk to any of his friends. He wouldn't shower, right? Like this world wasn't real for him really. So he didn't, none of his concerns linked up and saw it as the thing to call forward. He wouldn't talk to any of his friends, but he would only talk to them when they were online doing their gaming thing. He would like come out of this whole world, right? And I think that was a real extreme example, but it looks to me like that's like the beginning of what we're looking at. And I don't exactly know what to make of all of that, right? But the implications are huge.
I don't welcome it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's a very good point.
Oh, nice to meet you, my friend.
Yeah, it's been really fun.
Yeah, thank you for I really appreciated your generosity of sharing yourself and sharing what you're up to in your life, and like what you said, but also like the listening, right? The listening that you have, which I could feel draw both of us out in rich ways. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the time to read my book, first of all. And I really appreciate it. Basically the same thing. I appreciate how much you got the sense of what I was talking about and wanted to talk about it further. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
See ya. Bye-bye.